Okay, so today I'd like to touch base on a little bit of a more complex setup. Parallel connecting of two inverters with multiple batteries, and then obviously your BMS communication, how to do the setup. It's basically similar to the normal installations, however there is some tweaking that we need to have a look at. Firstly, the inverters I'm about to connect is two 5 kVA inverters. Now generally if you go up to bigger inverters, like the 8 kVA, then obviously your cable thickness might be a problem. So generally it will be better to use a combiner box, bus bars, to do all of your connections. It is the same when you connect multiple batteries. Your load is just too much for a pair of cables. These cables are normally shared with the 9.6 Powerwall, which is operating on 48 volts at 200 amp hours. That is basically your limit. I would suggest as soon as you go over the 48 volt 200 amp hour mark, to fit an additional pair of cables, which we're going to do today. Okay, starting with the battery modules. In this case I have 5 B3 modules. Each module rates at 75 amp hour, over 48 volts. If you have a look at 3 of these modules, 3 of them combined will bring you to an amp hour rating of 225 amp hour. So again, you will see that these cables run to your combiner box to again evenly spread the load over the cables, so that obviously not one pair cable handle majority of the power. Okay, so I've connected the batteries in 2 banks in parallel with one another. You will notice that I have 3 modules connected in parallel at the top, and then I have modules number 4 and 5 connected in parallel. Technically speaking, I now have 2 battery banks. So generally you will, if you have one pair of cables, you will connect the one cable positive to the top, and then your negative you will run to the bottom, and that will evenly charge all 3 batteries, as the positive and the negative from the inverter is across all 3 batteries. If you run the positive and the negative both to the same module, then this battery is going to get maximum charge, the middle a little bit less, and then obviously your last battery even less. So your bottom battery is not being as highly impacted as you will impact the top one. So generally you will always connect from the inverter across all your modules. Now in this case, because we use a combiner box, you have your bus bars. Generally all of the cables will share an even amount of power. All of your bus bars, your 2 bus bars is handling majority of the load. So you should have an even amount of power on these cables. So you should not worry too much of which cables you connect where, as long as you still connect across the batteries. Okay, so starting with the first pair of cables, your positive will go to the first battery, and then across you will connect the negative from your combiner box. So at this stage, battery 1, 2 and 3 are being cross-fed from the combiner box. Now we need to connect the second pair of batteries. again from the same combiner box. You have your positive to the top going across the battery bank, and you will connect your last remaining battery. So technically all of these batteries is now parallel connected from the same combiner box. So even though you do have two different banks of batteries, they will evenly charge. Okay, so next up is the BMS cable running between the inverter and the battery. Now generally you will find already made up cable within the Dynesss battery boxes. It will be either marked as Infinity Solar or Expert King within the Dynesss battery box. But let's say for argument's sake you do not have this cable and you will need to make one. Let's use the normal color coding on the RJ45 plug going to the battery with the normal networking color scheme. So you will need to snip the RJ45 on the inverter side so you can rewire the RJ45 plug. On the battery side, pin number 1 is your orange and white. Will go to the inverter side, pin number 5. And then battery side, pin number 3, green and white, will go to your inverter side, pin number 3. Inverter side, you will connect to your inverter marked with lithium ion, and then your battery cable will be connected to the first battery. Now keep in mind, first thought you will have is which one of these two inverters is your master, and then obviously which one of these batteries is your master. You will need to set the battery that you connect this cable that we now connected as your master. The cable, the BMS cable coming from the inverter needs to be connected to the master battery. So for this inverter we need to change your dip set, your dip switch to 0, 1, 0, 0, meaning your first dip is off, second dip on, third and fourth dips are off. For all of the remaining battery you will leave the dips in the off position. They will then be your slaves. Now something I do tend to find is these dips do sometimes not make proper contact. Should you eventually see that you struggle to find communication where the inverter constantly gives you error 61 that is not detecting, it's good to maybe just take the dip, switch it back and forth, up and down, just so it makes contact again, and then reset it again to your master setting. Again, as mentioned, for this inverter, the King 5 kVA, dip 1 off, 2 on, 3 and 4 is off. This is your master battery. Now for the inverter, you do not actually need to worry which one is master or which one is slave. Generally, how these inverters work, the first one that switches on is generally automatically switched as the master inverter, but the master inverter will not necessarily be the one communicating with the battery. The one communicating with the battery will be the one that's connected with this cable. So it's irrelevant which one of these inverters is master and slave. The one that's connected, that will be the one communicating with the battery. So next up is to connect these batteries together. You will receive a short cable like this in the Dynesss box. From the master batteries out, it will go to the second batteries in. Now this is a normal networking cable. If you have a look at the color coding scheme, it's a normal networking cable. So in this case it's very easy. As we're running these batteries back to back, obviously this cable will reach easily. But let's say for argument's sake you're going to run the batteries on the wall next to one another, then obviously this cable will be too short. You can just use a normal networking cable with the normal networking scheme. That will work as well. But for a nice and neat setup here where we have a short distance to travel, you'll obviously use the short one. So now we'll just keep on repeating this process from out to next batteries in, from this batteries out to the next batteries in, from this batteries out to the next batteries in. Okay, so just to recap, the inverter using the networking cable, the BMS cable that we've rewired, will be the inverter communicating with the battery. This will run to the first battery module that we've set as a master, dip setting 0, 1, 0, 0. From there you run out to in, out to in, out to in, out to in on all of your batteries with your dip settings all on 0, 0, 0. Okay, so the wiring between the inverters and the batteries is currently done. Next up is to connect the parallel connection between the two inverters. With each inverter you will receive a pair of cables. One is your communications cable that we just showed, and then the second is your sync cable. You will receive a pair of these cables with each inverter, so you will need two pairs of cables. Obviously your second cable will have your second pair of cables. Now the nice thing about these inverters is the parallel kit that's already installed in this inverter are all the same. So generally, even though this is a king inverter, it doesn't matter if you use a max 8 kVA, max 11 kVA, this king, or even the MKS models, even the InfiniSolar ones, they all use the same parallel cord. So the syncing cable that we have here looks like a VGA cable, but difference is it's male to female. Now when you have two inverters, it's fairly easy to connect. You'll obviously connect the one side of the cable to the port it fits on, and then the second cable to the one it fits on over there. Then your second pair of cables you'll connect. So in this case, your two ports far from one another will be connected, and then the ports close to one another is connected. Okay, the syncing cables is connected. Now for the current sharing cables, the left port will be connected to the second inverter's left port, and then the right port will be connected to the second inverter's right port. So just to recap again, the syncing cable's left plug will go to the outside plug of the second inverter, and then from the inside plug it will go to the inside plug of the second inverter. and then your current sharing cable left to left, right to right. Fairly easy on a setup like this where you have only 2 inverters. Note it does get a little bit more complex if you run up to 9 inverters in parallel, so please refer to the user manual to confirm the correct order how these cables need to run. It's quite critical that you have it connected correctly in the correct string. You cannot just connect as you want. You have to have it in a specific order. Okay, now that the inverters has been connected and on, first thing I'd like for you to check is the firmware of the inverter. Now, while it's on the home screen displaying this, just press the up button and it will start displaying a U1 number, sorry, U4. Press up, U4. I need you to check U2 0270, U2 0270. This is your remote panel firmware and it's the same. Next up is your control board firmware, U1 7197, U1 7197. U1 is very important when you have a parallel connection. You do need to have your firmware the same on both inverters. If the hardware or the firmware is not the same, then the parallel system will not work. So it's very important, make sure that when you do installation, generally if you get the same inverters with the same order, it should be the same. Nonetheless, double check it when you do a firmware update that the firmware do correspond. Preferably do not switch on the second inverter. Let's just switch on one of the inverters at a time. Long press of the enter button till you get the 00 ESC display. Go down to number 28. Now we've already set this to PAL, which is your parallel setup that we need. Note, you cannot make any changes. It does not allow you. It's because your inverter is currently engaged. It does not allow you to make any changes. In some cases it will be better to switch on your input grid power as well. That will enable the inverter to remain on. But in this case I do not want to switch on the second inverter, so I just try to be quick about changing this setting. So for argument's sake, going down to setting number 28. Before you press the enter button, switch off the inverter, press enter, and then you can change the setting. Press enter. It's now on SIG. Now the inverter will switch off if you do not switch it on again. Switching it on, we can go down again to setting number 28. As you can see, that makes its change. So just keep in mind, if the inverter is actively on with the power button, it's engaged, it will not change. You need to shut this power button off so it's in standby before this changing will make effect. So let's just change it back to PAL again. Power off the inverter, enter, you can switch it on again. Okay, you can switch this inverter off. Okay, so next up is the BMS communication. to get the inverters to set up to communicate with the batteries on BMS communication. Note I've just unplugged this cable. I actually want to see the inverter not communicating with the batteries. Now, as I've mentioned before, it does not matter which one of these inverters is master and which one is slave. The one connected to that BMS cable will be the inverter communicating with the batteries. So currently this is my slave inverter marked as SL. Press enter till the 00 escape comes on. Go down to number 5. It's currently set to AGN, which is your lead acid deep cycle batteries. Press enter and you can change this either to PYL, which is your pylon tech, or you can change it to LIC, which is your third party batteries. Okay, now coming to the master, this inverter will not be connected to the batteries. Now, even though it is the master, like I've said, it's not necessarily always going to be the master. It will change depending on how these inverters shut down and switch on again. Normally the first inverter that comes on after a complete shutdown will be your master inverter. Press enter. Go down to your battery type setting number 5. Now this needs to be on USE. It should not be anything else. Now, because we have it connected in parallel, generally this setting will automatically change. But just for argument's sake, do not come and change this to PYL or LIC as well, because that is the two settings you need to set it to the inverter that's going to communicate with the battery. As mentioned, we're not going to set this one up to communicate with the battery. It's going to be this one. So this needs to be on USE. This one, as mentioned, we leave on LIC to communicate with the batteries. So currently just waiting for the 61 warning to pop up to establish communication. There we go. 61 warning. Now, as mentioned, you can see this is your slave inverter, but because we've set the inverter to our right as the inverter connected to the battery, set it on battery type number setting 5 to LIC. This is the inverter currently looking for the BMS communication. This is not still on master. It's not giving you any warning at this stage. 61 warning, it tells you there's no communication. It's because I've deliberately disconnected the BMS connector to show you this setup. Connecting the BMS cable. Now, as previously mentioned, this is the cable running to your master battery that we've set to the DIP 0100. Just give it some time. Normally it takes about a minute to establish BMS communication if your cable pinout is correct. There we go. So currently you can see the 61 has been cleared and the battery icon is flashing. The flashing battery icon means the battery BMS communication is established and it is communicating with the set of batteries. Now, do not be alarmed that this icon do not flash. Just because it does not flash does not mean it's not communicating. Obviously, this is the inverter connected with the comms cable that is doing the communication with the battery, but this inverter will use the grey cables to communicate with this inverter to tell it what to do with the voltages. For argument's sake, let's go to your parameters. Setting number 6 is your bulk voltage. You can see the inverter automatically set it to 53.5. This inverter told this inverter to change that setting. It will be the same on your flooded as well as your low DC cutoff voltage at 45. This inverter is already telling this inverter what to do. Okay, that is it. The two inverters is connected in parallel. They're communicating with one another. The one inverter is set up to communicate with the master battery, and obviously the master battery will communicate with all of the batteries it's connected to. All is communicating, all is up and running, all is ready. One thing I'd like to mention, the parallel kits in all of the RCT inverters is the same, so the setup will be the same as well. I've only noticed them changing the parallel kits in the Max ESS model. You will notice the parallel cables is not the serial type of 9-pin cables anymore. It's changed to the RJ45 networking cables as well. But generally referring to these type of parallel kits, all is the same, all work the same. You can use the same setup even though you have a different RCT inverter. For the battery BMS communication, you will notice that on the newer age Dynesss batteries, I like to refer to them as the 100 series. I'm talking about the BX 48100, A48100 and the BX 51100. They've changed the networking port on the battery. Instead of using pins 1 and 3 as I previously mentioned, the white and orange and green and white cables, pin number 1 and 3 on the battery side, they've changed it on the 100 series to pin number 1 and 2, your 2 oranges. So you do need to rewire the BMS communication from the 100 series battery to accommodate for the inverter. Please refer to one of my previous videos. I shared a link in my comments below. That will actually show you how to connect the 100 series with the correct BMS cable to these inverters, and that should solve the communication cable. 61 warning should you have it. Other than that, it's all up and running. We're ready to go. Thank you very much.